Welcome to a very special Rejected Religion Spotlight. As you can see, I have some very special guests with me today. And we're going to be talking about Midnight Mass, the Netflix show. For those of you who have followed my platform for a while, you will recognize my guests. But for those who are new, I don't know if I'm doing this mirrored. Okay, so I'm just going to start with my top left. Jonathon O'Donnell was a guest on the podcast talking about demonology in U.S. politics and other matters in their book Passing Orders, which I highly recommend. Below Jonathon is Brennan. Brennan was a guest of mine on my very first Spotlight interview, discussing the figure of Lilith and how Lilith plays into the work of poet Renee Vivian. And then under myself, Tommy Cowan. Tommy was one of my first guests on the podcast. We talked about William Burroughs and his associations with occult practices. So that's a little short intro of my guests. Thank you all very much for being here today with me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Great. I'm so happy that you had the time to talk with me today. Okay, so for the viewers and the listeners out there, this is not going to be a review of the show itself, as many YouTube channels have done in the past. They talk in depth about the show and in details about the plot and about all of the characters and all of those types of things. We're not going to be doing that. This is a much broader discussion. My guests and myself, we all have our own interests and own areas of specialty. So what we're going to be talking about are more things that are related to the show, of course, but not specifically about the show, if that makes any sense. So it's going to be a much broader discussion, as I said before. So I guess maybe we should do a little go around and start with giving some brief first impressions of what you felt and thought about when you were, watching the show. But maybe in this case, I'll go first with the first impressions, and then we'll take it from there. So, right, I have, I guess, three main things that stood out to me. That this was a story with very many layers and very many themes that were all interwoven. Themes such as addiction, grief, loss, free will, forgiveness, sacrifice, faith, love, existential questions, propaganda, prejudice, extremism, all of these things that could go on and on and on. But that's just a few that came up when I was watching it. The second was I had to really laugh because it seemed like this show turned The Exorcist on its head. And I have a few points here as well as to why I think that. So the first being that the priest is supposed to be this, holy man of God, but he's actually one of the evil characters, if you want to look at it very literally black and white. Priest is acting on his own emotional desires first, and spiritual goals only come in second place for him. Bev Keen is the embodiment of zealotry and hypocrisy, and perhaps even a figure of evil, but I will return to her later in the discussion. The atheist Riley rejects the temptation or sin of the priest and sacrifices himself, and yet he is seen as a Judas by Bev Keen. Vampires in the show, although, the word vampire I don't think was ever named. Did you ever hear the word vampire being mentioned?
No, I was unsure for a long time if the universe, if it technically took place in a universe where vampire folklore like didn't exist, or
Good
not.
point.
I wasn't actually sure. I think there might be like a brief mention to like myths of blood-sucking entities at one point, but the word
Yes.
vampire is never used.
Yes. Just as an aside, when Sarah was talking to the other women about looking into the history of, I guess, blood diseases, she does mention something about this condition or this myth or something like that, but I never heard the word vampire. Okay, so we're on board here then with regard to that. Anyway, so back to what I was saying. The vampires are beings that are often portrayed as being evil creatures in horror literature and film. But here, the vampire is equated with an angel of the Lord. So I thought that was very interesting, even though this being looks very demonic as is traditionally depicted. And then, of course, Christianity's most holy sacrament is linked to vampirism, the blood drinking process of vampirism. I thought those were all very, very interesting and kind of almost, made me laugh from time to time about how blatantly obvious this was, that the show was using these tropes in that way. And lastly, this show seemed to really highlight the ease in which people can slip into hypocrisy and zealotry, as well as cowing to an authority that is seen as being moral and good, which I feel is quite horrifying. So that kind of touches on my talking points for later, but let's move on now to next person who would like to share their first impressions.
I can share quickly. I also had, I think, maybe 3 succinct first impressions. First, of course, I just felt like the show was one of the most thorough and pointed critiques in pop culture that I've seen of religion, specifically critiquing or framing the ways in which religion can inspire acts of ultraviolence and cruelty. So, of course, first impression. Second, similar to you, Stephanie, actually, it was really interesting to watch the trope of the hero priest, who is usually the sacrificial lamb in order to cast out evil, such as Anthony Hopkins in The Rite, The Exorcist, The Omen, The Exorcist of Emily Rose, was really subverted in this, whereas the priest, Father Pruitt, was the bringer of evil, literally transported evil from a different country or continent to this small island. Which was interesting. And then the last kind of impression I had was that vampires are usually, at least in my experience, or interactions with the vampire myth and discourse, is they're usually heavily queer-coded. And there were some minor queer themes within Midnight Mass, but this queer-coded vampiric monster doesn't really fit within the Midnight Mass narrative, which I found interesting. Rather, it's this question of, is this a monster? Is this an angel? And that kind of, I think I mentioned to you Manon Hedenborg-White's theory of proximal authority, and how that kind of translates in this show as proximal monstrosity, like what is actually monstrous. But I like the queer-coded vampire. I didn't get any of that from Midnight Mass, but I thought that was interesting. So it's something to note, I guess.
Yes, it's very different than what you normally would see with vampire stories. So who's up? Who's next?
I guess I'll go next.
Okay.
So I think similar to both of you, actually. Like, I think my initial impression was it's like reversal of the hero priest concept in terms of like the way it was positioning itself. Although I'm not entirely although it does have similarities, but I'm still unsure if it fits directly because of the way that hero priest narratives tend to rely on like disembodied spiritual evil to fight against, or like spiritual evil that like possesses, rather than like a physical monster that is brought across. So, like, in that sense, I wasn't sure if it was tempting to do a subversion, or whether like how that fit within the legacy of kind of,
right,
I guess, supernatural horror and the role of like specifically the Catholic priest, like as a figure within the role of supernatural horror. I did think it was like other than that, I think one of my initial impressions were its, I guess, processing of extremism, its processing of its critique of religion, specifically the critique of like organized religion and authority as part of organized religion. The way that it used the island and the town as this kind of microcosm of, I guess, the tensions within American society broadly, that it was obviously kind of attempting, at least from my eye, to kind of portray in terms of zealotry, authority, like hatred of the other, scapegoating. Beyond that, like, I think maybe touching back on like your first point, Stephanie, about the multiple layers of the show, I think for me when I watched it, it was almost too much. Like, there was the sense that it was trying to convey too many themes simultaneously in a way that didn't quite work within like the narrative framework that it had set up.
Yeah, it's had a very lofty goals, I guess, in that case, if you're trying to include everything.
I mean, I often appreciate shows that I feel try and don't necessarily succeed, because I always think that they end up with more interesting tensions. And I guess we'll probably be talking about a lot more of those. Maybe as we go on today.
As an interesting aside, last weekend I had watched Archive 81, which is also another Netflix show, very highly culture. Every scene almost has something that has to do with the occult or. But I told my husband about it. I was watching it for a second time. He's watching it for the first time, and he stops in the middle of the second episode. He goes, this just doesn't seem very believable to me. And I'm like, of course it doesn't. That's the whole point of these types of shows. But you make a point of, there's this tension there that just doesn't, it just leaves you as the viewer not feeling like everything is in order or everything is right. So, but I think that these types of shows, not to say that I think the directors of these two shows are on the same wavelength or anything, but I think that often with shows that are supposed to be about, horror or other topics with occult themes and things like that, it seems to be all kind of disjointed and chaotic, and nothing seems to be, fitting into the place as you would expect it of other genres. So I take your point there. That's good observation. Okay, Tommy. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I just thought of like one other point that I think stuck out to me, like, is the role of the vampire, like, and specifically the vampire as angel, because the vampiric entity is only ever referred to within the show as the angel, right. And a lot of the commentary that I saw around the time, like sort of standard commentary kind of in the media that came out around the time that I was reading it, would refer to it as like, they'd talk about it as like Father Paul like brings back a vampire believing it to be an angel. And it's like, no, the show never says that it's not an angel. And like, I think that's actually quite key to the way that it kind of sets up its mythos, is like
right.
This could be an authentic version of Christianity, like, that is being portrayed. And like the show deliberately does not like actually make a claim regarding that.
Exactly. That's very interesting. Yes, I was beginning to doubt, to your point, Jonathan, I was beginning to doubt whether or not I was misinterpreting things. Like, is this really what they think angels look like? So
maybe.
Well, the way that they argued it is that, everyone in the Bible has ever encountered an angel in those stories. People were scared to death. They were terrified. So, there was something for that to be said for that. So share your ideas with us.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about, of course. I mean, it's about 7 or 8 hours of viewing, obviously, and there's a lot of monologues. It's very Tarkovsky in how many monologues it has. So there's a lot of thematic elements. I had a friend watch Stalker, and he'd never seen it before, and I asked him what he thought of it, and he says that needs more monologues. So I thought it was a good joke. So I think the first thing that jumped out at me thematically was that at least as far as when I was watching it, the primary theme kind of seemed to me to be a meditation on death and dying. Because it begins with Riley and the drunk driving accident killing Tara Beth, and that's a red thread that runs throughout it. But just all over the place, we see people. There's characters who die from cancer prior to the events of the story. There's characters suffering from dementia. Multiple characters suffering from dementia. And things like that. So it really seems that it says, and there's several monologues just specifically about death and what we think the afterlife could be, how people negotiate the fear of death, the pain of loss, this kind of thing. So that jumped out at me a lot. And there's a lot in the series about that. And it's very thoughtful, I think. It's a very literary kind of series. And obviously, religion, there's so much in the series about religion and about loss of faith, trying to find, a middle ground between rationality and faith, if there exists. I think Flanagan, who wrote and directed the series, he was raised Catholic and now considers himself kind of an atheist. So it sort of tells his story to some extent. But it's also very nuanced. It's not just about valuing rationality over faith, because I think we see in the story a lot of characters greatly benefit from religion in the story. So it really does argue from both sides quite a bit. To give an example, towards the middle of the series, Monsignor Paul is the one who suggests to Riley's father, Ed, that Ed and Riley have a sort of heartfelt discussion out on the fishing boat. And this is when Riley and his father reconnect for the first time. But this is theoretically one of the villains giving him this advice, but it leads to this really positive moment in this series. So there's this really nuanced depiction of religion as a positive social force and a negative social force simultaneously. So that also was very interesting.
Very good insights from all of you. Let's see. Why don't we now move to, let's talk about our own particular talking points. And then we can have the opportunity afterwards to ask questions or, give comments once we're finished.
Well, there's so many places to start. My mind is just spinning.
I got you. All right, no problem. I'll start first then. I'm going to refer to my notes here because I had to do a lot of thinking about this. My area of interest is about identity. So I did a lot of thinking about two characters, the Monsignor John Pruitt, or as Father Paul, as we first come to know him, and Bev Keen, the woman who was basically running the church while Monsignor Pruitt was away on his sabbatical. And while I found the stories about religious identity for many of the characters in the show interesting, I wanted to touch on these two characters because I thought to me, they just spoke to me. So, in particular, I'm looking at the psychological aspects of their story, their religious identity, their authority roles, and how they use their knowledge base, and how their belief or faith contributes to their sense of meaning and purpose, either for good or ill will. So I'd like to start with Bev Keen. As I stated before, she might be the most evil character in this story. On the surface, she seems to be the steadfast sister who's keeping the church running on the island while Monsignor Pruitt is away. She teaches the children at school. She's just an overall good Catholic lady. That's the way she wants to come across anyway. But we soon find out that she is, as Annie Flynn tells her, quote, not a good person, end quote. And I thought that was funny, too, the way Annie Flynn, I mean, she could have really laid into her, but she just said, you're just not a good person. Just thought that was so, sweet and kind of keeping in her character as well. So, looking at Bev, what she does, she's stealing money from the church. She kills a dog. And I think she even poisoned Monsignor Pruitt because he was reacting the same way the dog was reacting. So I think she poisoned him. So this story does a good job at showing what a hypocrite Bev really is, I think. The actress who played her, let me look at her name, was Samantha Sloyan. I thought she was an excellent actress for this role. She really convinced me that Bev was the antagonist in this tale. So when Father Paul, quote unquote, Father Paul comes to the island, Bev seems a bit standoffish and a little critical of him, noting his mistake in wearing the gold-colored chasuble instead of the green one on his first day. And as we move further along in the tale, we start to see a real power struggle going on between the two of them, especially once she knows that Father Paul is actually Monsignor Pruitt. When it comes to his resurrection, as it were, from the dead, then she starts to figure out, oh, wait a minute, this is what's really going on. So I'll get in more to the power struggle aspect in a bit, but I think her desire for power and control extends to everyone. It's not just Pruitt. She seems to feel superior to everybody, and she comes across as having this need for being right in everything. And we see this really, really beautifully in the cherry picking of scriptures to twist the situation to fit her vision of how people and things should be. So, for example, she slaps Mayor Wade across the face and quotes a Bible text from Deuteronomy about obeying the priest. And this is after they find Joe dead on the floor. And she says that Joe, the man who had been struggling with alcohol addiction, deserved death, and that God moved through Pruitt to bring the sword to the people. She even ironically tells Mayor Wade not to, quote unquote, cherry pick the glories of God when Wade shows his reluctance with her interpretation, which I thought was rich. In another scene with Riley, Bev admonishes him not to mock God's will. She quotes from the Gospel of John about eating Jesus' flesh and drinking his blood. And, most Catholics don't interpret this literally, but now she is very much taking a literal interpretation. And she tells him that this will give him the eternal life that, that all of us should be longing for. She asserts that God is preparing Riley, and everyone for that matter, for what is to come, and says that the Bible really, points out that this is not going to be pretty. And she's referring to the book of Revelation there. She seems to be very accepting of the violent nature of what's happening. And this makes sense to me, as she doesn't seem to hold life in very high regard. If you remember what she did to the dog, and also, in my opinion, what she did to Pruitt. And then later, when she's so eager to poison everyone in the congregation, she just doesn't seem, to have any type of second thoughts about that. She sees Riley as a Judas figure, as I mentioned before, and is disgusted that he rejected his gift, and later encourages Pruitt to share the gift with the congregation at Easter Mass by poisoning all of them, as I just said. But she doesn't take the poison herself, which I thought was also very telling about her character. So, in many ways, I think the show cleverly touches upon some sensitive nerves that a lot of people have, a lot of people are feeling, especially now. What Bev is doing is one example of this. Her judgmental attitude, I think, could be compared with the Karen phenomenon that's been highlighted so often in our society. You know, people who think that they can say and do whatever they want, no matter how hurtful or obnoxious or even wrong. On the other hand, though, I think we could all recognize that we often operate on our own knowledge base. And sometimes we can feel a sense of doing the right thing based upon what we know and what we've experienced. So in light of that, if we look at Bev's backstory, there's really not much to work with there. We don't really know her backstory other than the strong impression that we get that she's always been this way. And this is kind of supported by Annie's words, that Bev isn't a hero or a victim, and that it really upsets Bev that God loves everyone else as much as he does her. So we don't know what happened with her, of course, but we don't know what happened that brought about these attitudes within Bev. But in any case, I think that Bev shows that this type of thinking could happen to anybody, could happen to any of us. We're all, capable of being a Bev. Mm-hmm. And Bev truly thinks that she's right. And towards the end of the tale, she thinks that her idea to turn the congregation is the way to go. But, when looking at the entire story, we see that she doesn't really have a plan. And in many ways, she seems to be opportunistic in how she reacts to things. And I think she's a very sad character. And she's all alone in the end. She doesn't have anybody. So, yeah, kind of helps to reinforce that idea of maybe it is a good idea for us to think before we speak and think before we, do things, because, do you want to end up like that? So, in the worst case scenario. So that's about Bev. Monsignor Pruitt, on the other hand, I think he comes across as a truly conflicted character. He's a priest, but he's in love with a woman and has a child with her in secret. He feels called to serve God, yet is struggling with his emotions and his physical desires. His actions strongly suggest that the real reason he brought back the so-called angel of the Lord is to give the blood to his beloved Mildred, and not really to the congregation. That was kind of a second thought, I think, for him. His work with Riley in private and the congregation in general starts out seemingly well. And when he talks about second chances and that rebirth, resurrection, redemption, and eternal life are not abstracts but tangible gifts from God, we start to see where he's going with all of this stuff. And after his own death and resurrection as a vampire, even though that word wasn't used, his message comes across as, even more fervently. And he talks about the suffering of the Lord, fighting a war for the Lord that one can't see but only feel, that God will ask horrible things of his soldiers, that the gospel of the Lord is full of horror, that God's will dictates morality, and as God's will changes, so does morality. The gospel is good because of where it's headed, which is the resurrection. All of these things that he's talking about greatly disturbed Mildred, as well as other people in the congregation. But, here's another thing I think that touches another very sensitive nerve with a lot of people, and that's zealotry. This really gets under people's skin when we're talking about religious zealots. In this case, it's a Christian zealot, but it could be any zealot. Many people argue that there is a quote unquote good and a quote unquote bad. But when talking with the vampire Riley after he was turned, Pruitt stresses that he feels no guilt in killing because he serves God and does God's will as his vessel. And this is another thing that that you see often with this type of rhetoric, a zealot rhetoric that, this is God's will. and what had happened was God's plan. So, yeah. So there's this then kind of disconnect from feeling any guilt or any other type of emotions that would make one think that this is wrong what you're doing. But I think if we look at towards the end, I think we, at least I'm thinking, he knows that it's wrong, but he's just using this as an excuse that this is God's plan. Anyway, that's up for debate, I guess. Because, he eventually does see that this is not good, what he's doing. So, but by then it's too late. But I think this all gives us interesting insights into the nature of evil. Is evil like just one way? Is evil just all bad? Or are there nuances to evil? So, yeah, another little area that you could go wander off in. So getting back to identity, the identities of these two seem to be very wound up in their religious beliefs, but in different ways. While Pruitt sees himself as a servant of God and his religion as a sense of comfort and guidance, Bev, I think, sees herself as religious, but only to justify her own prejudices and belief about her own superiority. And I think she uses religion as a tool to make her appear special. And that religion, in this way, helps her to feel like she's supported in what she thinks, says, and does. And then returning to the power struggle, we see how easily Bev turns on Pruitt when he realizes that what he and Bev are doing is actually wrong. After Bev practically burns down the whole island, she claims that the church buildings will be the quote-unquote ark or shelter for the vampires. But when Pruitt realizes that what they've been doing needs to stop, her loyalty to him quickly flies out the window. And she turns on him, claiming that Jesus commanded them not to follow the hypocritical priests. So she chastises one of the islanders for not being a believer, rejects him from going into the shelter, all the while this man had just killed his entire family, and he is, he's just feeling tremendous guilt and sadness about that, but she just has no care for that at all. Pruitt sees all of this happening and goes against Bev, welcoming the man into the church. Although by this time, everything's been doused in gasoline and set on fire. So there's just, everything is just going to literal hell in a handbasket. And then we're getting towards the end here. Sarah, his daughter with Mildred, she dies, and it seemed like that was the catalyst for him, that he finally realizes what's really important to him. Takes off the collar, throws it away, and it seems that his decision to finally choose what was most important to him, which was his family, is the thing that gives him the most peace. But by then, there's no time left, so it's very bitter in that sense. A bitter type of peace, I guess, that he might have. But he lets go of this false identity of the priest, and he seems ready to die. He doesn't seem to be, fighting against it. On the other hand, Bev is frantically fighting against it, trying to dig herself into the sand, trying to save herself. So when I was, thinking about all of this stuff that I just mentioned, to me, it seems like this story really emphasizes the need for people to be true to themselves, but also for the need of self-criticism as well. And by that, I mean, really examining your own beliefs and viewpoints, taking a hard look at what you're doing and asking, is this good? Is this helpful? Is this compassionate? Questions like that, which, Bev didn't ask. So I think this really shows a stark contrast of the message that is supposed to be coming from Christianity, which is supposed to be about love and compassion, and how this plays out in the lives of these two people. So that's my talking point. It's not exhaustive. I mean to say, of course, there were many, many other things that could be said about Monsignor Pruitt and Bev Keen, but I'll just leave it there and just wonder if anybody has anything they'd like to add.
Well, actually, I'm just thinking now in your kind of comparison of these two polar characters, the characters in which Monsignor Pruitt aligned himself with and the characters that Bev seemed to hate the most, it's kind of this similar sample pool of the typical outsider or the demonized member of society. So I'm thinking the lesbian, the former criminal, the single mother-to-be, the Muslim. And so as you're kind of talking about their, I guess, differences in the way they were enacting their versions of Christianity, that kind of just made me think of, the two sides of the coin of any organized religion, of being either, ultra-violence or, I think what you were saying, compassion and, devotion. But quick thought from what you...
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that completely meshes, so totally.
Well, I can jump in and,
sure.
and kind of piggyback on some stuff. So I look at intertextuality a lot, and I'll use the same word for talking about ideological or, let's say, some type of thematic transmission in cinema as well. I'll use the word intertextual. And I think intertextuality connects to theme and topic in this way, and morals in the sense that it gives you more avenues to look at when you dig deep into some of the inspirations. And I think there's a clear allusion in the church scene towards the end of the series. I believe it's in book 6 or episode 6, if we want to say, where everyone's drinking the poison at the church. It's a clear allusion to the Jonestown Massacre. And I believe Flanagan has said in an interview before that he considers the Jonestown Massacre to be one of the worst things that ever happened in history, which is hard to argue with. It's pretty awful. It really is a type of micro-genocide that happened there. But it's interesting in that line to sort of branch out into a theme, to think about Jim Jones. And I believe Bev is kind of a reference to Jim Jones in a certain way, because Jim Jones had a bunch of people drink poison, but then himself did not drink poison. He did commit suicide, but didn't drink the poison, much similar to how Bev did. So it is interesting. And it's interesting to think about the connection between charisma, religion, and politics. And charisma plays such an important role in this series. But I always wonder, because Bev is not necessarily very charismatic. She has moments of fire and passion, but really most of the characters don't like her. So which is a little bit different from Jim Jones, who was very charismatic. So it's interesting to see Jim Jones, perhaps the personality of Jim Jones, split and dispersed throughout several different characters in that arc.
Interesting. I didn't immediately make that connection, but now that you mention it, I'm like, well, yeah, obviously.
Yeah, that's not something I thought about either, and I'm like, oh, yeah, of course. Like, now it's pointed out, it's very clear.
Of course.
I think, Tommy, you also hit on earlier comments the themes of death and grieving and dying. And I feel like that is such an obvious theme in the show, but when I was watching the show, I was just so hung up on, which character is a monster, which is angelic, which is good, and I was just and queer themes, etc. That I just fully I feel skipped by Erin's I think it was Erin, the character Erin, her beautiful kind of dying monologue. I was just like, okay, great, this is nice, but what happens to the vampire angel after? And so, but I think that's such an important point. But also, it speaks to your point, Jonathon, where there's a lot going on in this show, and so to comprehensively wrap one's head around all of these themes can be a little tricky. But yeah, I appreciate these all the other themes that are kind of coming through now.
Indeed.
Because I wanted to kind of piggyback off like the point that that Brennan made about the alignment with the outsider, like towards the end, like the lesbian, the former criminal, the single mother to be, the Muslim, and like it kind of ties into the way that like this is a series that's like produced like in the wake of the Trump presidency, like in America, and like as someone who like my primary research focus is like contemporary American demonologies, particularly like Protestant demonologies, and like their relationship to kind of structures of demonization and dehumanization in contemporary America. So I look a lot at like queer phobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, general structures of like anti-blackness and settler coloniality, like within contemporary America. But like coming at it from that lens, it was very clear to me that the show was staging, I guess, like a dichotomy or a contest between a kind of Christian nationalist vision of here Catholicism, but like primarily like through the figure of Bev Keen, and like I think initially also Pruitt / Paul, although he kind of shifts towards the end. But this idea of the kind of the singular community of like authentic Christians who kind of represent the community as it kind of quote unquote should be, like in their minds. This kind of versus like the atheist Riley, like Sheriff Hassan, who's Muslim, like the lesbian doctor whose name is unfortunately escaping me right now.
Sarah.
Yeah. And like also but also like Erin, like representing like a different form of Christianity that's like not conscious, like not aligned in the same way as kind of as Bev Keen. And like the form of Christianity that like I think that Monsignor Pruitt kind of ultimately kind of quasi comes across to like at the end of the show with his kind of like heel face turn, I guess, that he kind of undergoes like in the kind of final episode. Looking at it from that, like that's kind of the angle that I approached the show at, and I was kind of really interested in the way that it like attempted to represent that and attempted to represent this kind of this tension, which I think then is interestingly played out in the fact that, I guess spoilers for anyone who hasn't watched the show, basically everybody dies like at the end of the show. Like, there's this element to which, like, you have these two competing ideas of, like, America, essentially, that are being kind of staged on this island, on, like, Crockett Island. Actually, as a query, like, is Crockett Island ever actually, like, located, like, geographically? Because it's off the coast, but, like, I'm not sure
if it's
which
a real
coast
place,
or
you mean?
where.
Coast.
Yeah.
I assumed it was east.
Yeah, I assumed East Coast too,
Yeah.
but I was curious if the show ever, because I assumed it was a fictional island, but I wasn't entirely sure like where it was specifically supposed to be located.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I assumed the same. I thought it was a fictional place.
That's a great question. I never even thought about it.
Yeah. Essentially, they're staging this conversation around religious identity kind of in America through this vessel of kind of supernatural horror and through this contest between different forms of community that are being kind of played out. And essentially, like, and then the show kind of concludes with essentially the fact that if the one that's represented by Bev Keen, like, wins, quote unquote, it basically kills everybody. Like, with the exception of, like, a couple of survivors. Like, it destroys everybody else, but then it also destroys itself. And I also thought, like, interestingly related to this is the fact that the show takes place on an island, in the context of the kind of quasi-isolationist discourse that was kind of occurring, like, during the Trump presidency regarding, like, the role of America on the global stage.
Mm-hmm.
Like, one of the themes that comes up in some of the kind of evangelical writers that I've studied, particularly the more Christian nationalist ones, when they're focusing on domestic politics, there's this focus on kind of internal purification that is like this kind of return to an authentic idea of like American Christianity. but which then sets the stage for kind of overseas missionary projects and this kind of rebirth of American global power. And I felt that was interestingly staged, like within Midnight Mass, in terms of like Bev Keen's image of kind of creating this purified, authentic religious community on the island that then was going to kind of set off in an arc to like transform the world, like in accordance with its kind of new values that it had kind of created. Yeah. So like those are some of my
just a few little thoughts that I had blow my mind. No, I am really amazed by what you're talking about, because I'm thinking to myself, yes, of course, this is all happening after Trumpism, and I'm wondering what your opinion, Jonathan, is of what I was talking about with this Karen phenomenon. Whether, if you take away gender, we just use Karen as the indicator of this type of attitude. Would you say that this plays into a political type of like an aftermath, or a political, maybe not so much aftermath, but political shift of the way people are behaving in the United States?
Like in terms of the Karen phenomenon broadly?
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting because like the concept of like the Karen it's specifically racialized in the sense that it's generally like a white woman like complaining about often people of color, particularly black workers. Like Bev Keen is definitely the kind of person who would speak to the manager. Like I think we should get that out of the way.
Definitely.
But it is this sense of like that use of a kind of racialized white authority to kind of reinforce particular forms of violence and power structures, which like in the form of the Karen is generally either the police through like calling cops on people, or like the manager in the sense of the workplace, this kind of like instatement of like workplace discipline in order to kind of maintain and restore like a proper hierarchy within society. I definitely think it like plays into like things like the Trump presidency and the post-Trump presidency, but primarily in the way that it like articulates those like underlying like racialized and gendered structures like within American society.
Yeah, and when you're talking, it makes me think of that scene where they're all in the classroom having a little meeting about whether or not they can read Bible verses in a public school, and how Bev was talking to the sheriff about, if it were a Muslim reading out of the Quran, it would, that whole discussion. There seemed to be a discussion on many levels there. It was religious, it was ethnic, maybe even gender played a role in there. I'm not certain. Maybe the way Bev thinks that Muslim men think about women. Maybe there's all these, these ideas in there as well. But definitely about that, wanting to keep the authority over everything. But the way she does it, it's just that sickening, sweet, very fake.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a specific weaponization of like a certain type of like, I guess like female managerial authority. You might want to term it like specifically like white female managerial authority.
Yeah.
Within that context, over those who she perceives as like below her station in terms of authority. Like specifically here, like Sheriff Hassan is like the sort of brown Muslim outsider who's kind of come to the island. And of course, like that ties into the kind of underlying discourse of like foreignness and like having come from elsewhere, and like therefore not having like a like quote unquote like legitimate place within the community.
Right. When I was watching the show and it got to the point where Dr. Sarah went to the sheriff and said, I think you need to sound the alarm because of, what's going on. And he went into this whole story about his background and about 9/11 and about being a Muslim and about all the things that happened to him and why he came to the island in the first place. And it was, very much politicized in his, his argument against why he wasn't going to do anything. I thought to myself, that's kind of strange why he would use that as a argument against doing something. But now that I'm going back and thinking about all of these other things that, as you said, there was just so many things kind of packed into this story. But yeah, this is actually an example of what happened in the classroom with Bev lecturing him about, about what's right. So it's all, it does seem to have a connection there. And that's a deeper I guess a deeper argument, deeper discussion, a deeper tension that is probably there for a lot of people. And whether, regardless of whether it's about religion or whether it's about ethnicity or whether it's about gender or whether it's about another type of quote unquote other status, economic, it doesn't really, I guess it can apply to any strata, I suppose. But yeah, I'm starting to come to all these new insights now, thinking about it and talking about it with you. So anyway, enough from my end. Brennan, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I actually really kind of want to piggyback off of one of Jonathon's main points, which is that this show is occurring kind of, in tandem with the cultural backdrop of the Trump presidency. Simultaneously, monsters always occur against a cultural backdrop, even the same monster. Their monstrosity, their core monstrosity may stay the same, but the way that this monstrosity is expressed or received shifts based on different cultural backdrops. There's a historian of monsters, Jeffrey Jerome Cowan, who speaks of the monster's body as being a culture's body. Basically, the monster is a projection of a culture's fears, insecurities, prejudices, and he actually uses the vampire to illustrate this. So if you take Bram Stoker's Dracula. This was a vampiric monster as a kind of beware of the strange, kooky outsider or foreigner. Moving to the Nosferatu vampiric representation as kind of a representation of sexual lust and hunger during a cultural backdrop of fascism and extreme ultraviolence and oppression. Moving to Francis Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, in which the Dracula is extremely queer-coded, and there's a lot of campy homoerotic themes, and this occurred against the cultural backdrop of the AIDS pandemic. And so after I watched the show Midnight Mass, I was pretty convinced that in a Stephen King-esque way, I guess, the people are the monsters. That's the point of this. Right. And then now thinking of this as thinking of the Midnight Mass being against the cultural backdrop of the entire Trump era actually kind of deepens this assertion for me, because I do think that, obviously, the Trump era was extremely divisive and fascistic, and kind of brought out, the monstrosity that's bubbling under the surface. And this show kind of plays on that a bit. So I'm actually happy that you had said that, Jonathan, because I'm like, oh yes, the monsters backdrop. This is perfect. It is situated. But another point I guess I also wanted to make in speaking of monsters was that typically, if we look at a monster as a way to understand a culture and a religion by what this culture fears. So obviously Lilith, her shifting mythos is kind of moves with the times of increasing female empowerment or male powerlessness in the sexual arena, et cetera, et cetera. However, in Midnight Mass, I feel like we can understand the characters and their religious institution by the monster they embrace, which to me is the angel, and the embrace of Bev as the leader at the end. And then, just lastly, because prior to this panel was thinking also of the angel as a monster, even though now I'm not convinced, because maybe the angel is actually what Christians believe angels actually are, because the vampire word was never said. So I'm a little shaky on this opinion, I suppose. But in assigning the angel as a literal monster that was then brought into the community by a religious leader, this angel does fit to the typical descriptions of what is monstrous. It doesn't respect borders, positions, the rules. It's abject. It has the ability to fly. It has superhuman strength. It has, this monster in particular has a diet of blood. It exists between thresholds. And usually that's what makes a monster so monstrous. In Midnight Mass, it's what makes this monster kind of holy. And I thought that was a really interesting subversion. I'm still even kind of like, after watching Midnight Mass, trying to play with that in my mind of like, okay, what now? A religious institution accepted a monster and shifted the monstrous to the holy and what to do with that. But that's, my rant.
Thank you for your rant. No, very, very interesting points that you raised there. A lot of food for thought. I'm still thinking about it. I don't know if anyone else has anything they'd like to add.
Yeah, I guess I'd like because I mentioned it earlier, like the positioning of the angel as like the ambivalent or like ambiguousness within the show about whether it is actually an angel or not, or like whether this is actually what angels are, as opposed to a thing that Monsignor Pruitt has discovered in a cave and like mistook for a holy being. And I think that does actually an interesting thing, like to go back to the point I made earlier about like the forms of Christianity that are being kind of played with in the show. Because if we read, like as a religious studies scholar, and particularly as a religious studies scholar who studies like reactionary forms of Christianity, like one of the things that often like I come across are people claiming that these people are not Christian. They're like inauthentically Christian. And it's like, no, like that's not how religion works for a start. Like just because you don't like these people's form of Christianity or that it's harmful or it's violent, that doesn't make it inauthentic. That just means that like it's maybe not good for the rest of us. But I think the positioning of the angel as like potentially an angel like does interesting things regarding that, because it shifts the like structure from a conflict between like a right form of Christianity and a wrong form of Christianity to a Christianity that will kill everyone if it wins versus like a Christianity that won't. And neither of these are necessarily like more or less authentic than the other, but one leads to an infinitely more violent like solution at the end of it. And I think that's one of the interesting things that like having the angels like relative holiness ambiguous like allows us to kind of look at through Midnight Mass.
Do you think that was deliberate, that there was a deliberate choice in that? I mean, this is just a guess. I mean, like, of course, this is your guess.
I definitely think that like there was a deliberate choice to like leave the angel like as just the angel, like whether that then ties into the broader point I made about the types of Christianity. Like I have no idea if that was probably not, to be honest, but who knows. But I definitely think the ambiguity around the angel is interesting. Although there is something that I'm like really actually unsure about, and I'd kind of like to pickle your brains over it, is where the angel comes from. Because like Brennan was talking about, like the history of the vampire as like a cultural symbol, like particularly the context of Nosferatu, for example, like arising in the background of fascism. And like the angel, of vampires, I feel that the angel bears like the most similarity to Nosferatu, like in terms of the trope. What does it mean in that context for the angel to have come from the Holy Land to America?
Wow. Zing. Okay.
Yeah, actually,
that I don't think was necessarily intentional, but it is something that has been playing on my mind.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Right.
Yeah, that's brilliant. How similar this vampire is to Nosferatu. Nosferatu was against the actual backdrop of fascism. The Trump era is a backdrop of fascism. And then, now adding in this Holy Land tomb. I mean, that, oh my goodness. Like, it couldn't have been intentional, but if it is, that's blowing my mind. I mean,
yeah, add me to the list. I am, mind blown.
What does that mean? Tommy, you're the intertextuality guy. What does this mean?
Good question. Well, let me kind of piggyback off of both of them and see if I can tie it together a little bit. I like what Jonathan's saying about the connection between racialized power structures and vampire lore here, and the creation of foreignness, and how we sort of regulate or demarcate a demos, and also Brennan's comments about vampire cinema and how cinema mirrors cultural backgrounds and things like that. And it's interesting to think about because vampire lore, or the myth of the vampire, becomes popular in Europe around the late 17th, sort of early 18th centuries. And it's related to witch hunts and what they call vampire scares, or sort of vampire hysterias, which are related to epidemics in Eastern Europe, where people were digging up graveyards and burning the cadavers because they were scared of disease. And it's interesting because this happens at a time like late 17th, early 18th centuries. It happens at a time when Western and Central Europe are trying to develop their ethnicity. And the vampire lore, which sort of first develops in Austria, Germany, France, these kinds of areas, it was part of an ethnification process of Eastern Europeans and Muslims. So even at the very beginning of vampire lore, there is like this racial element to it. It's part of the ethnification process, a very early like proto-anthropology. Mm-hmm. And to sort of like see when vampire lore develops as a literary genre, one of the primary things about it is a narrative of the struggle with disenchantment, but also what we see is Christianity is almost always used as the remedy or the antidote to vampirism, right? You present the cross, you throw holy water at the vampire, and this is prominent even in books as early as Carmilla. Mm-hmm. But what Midnight Mass does is invert that a lot, right? Because it's a synthesis of biblical scripture with vampire lore. So it completely destroys this idea of Christianity as the antidote to vampirism. And I think it really is a reflection of the politics of the time and the cultural background of vampire lore, not just as a representation or a reflection of contemporary politics, but how contemporary politics gets constructed and recreated and navigated. So I think that's very interesting to think about. And one of the things that comes out of post-critique or post-criticism is a suspicion as to how much good writing about critical ideas, how much good comes from that, right? Like how much good do we actually get from writing about critical race theory or Marxism or things like that? But I think when we look at the art that gets made from different eras, I mean, if you compare Bram Stoker's novel to Midnight Mass, we see completely different political dispositions. So I think if you look at the art that's made in these different eras, we do see the political ramifications of critical theory.
This point you made about this Midnight Mass synthesizing Christian literature with vampirism instead of presenting it as an anecdote or antidote. Same with instead of the hero priest motif, we have the enablist priest, I guess, the monstrous enabler, perhaps, I think is a really interesting point as well. I hadn't even thought of that. Yeah. Mike Flanagan did a lot with this show.
Certainly
really did.
Certainly did. That's why we're here talking about it. But something that popped into my mind, Tommy, was that looking at the identity of the creature, whatever the being was, we'll call it a vampire for the sake of argument. When you look at other types of stories that have either, the vampire as a monster or the vampire as kind of like an anti-hero in a sense, where people are, where the vampire is actually more of a protagonist instead of the antagonist. There are strong identities that these characters have. And in this show, the vampire really has no identity. The vampire is just like this empty vessel, as it were, that's used by the priest as the angel, but we don't really know what this being is. It's not specified. It's just it's given an identity, but in essence, it's just whatever it is, and it seems to be very fluid, I guess, in the sense of goes along easily with what the priest wants. It doesn't seem to resist that interpretation. There really is no, in my mind, I don't know what you guys think about it, but in my mind, there doesn't really seem to be any strong sense of who this creature is, whether it be an angel or a vampire. In the stories that we have about angels, they have a specific purpose. There's a specific goals that angels, they're created by God to serve God. And as far as demons and they all have their own roles. They all have their own identities in that sense of this is what they do. But in this story, it's just this being that hangs out in a cave in the Holy Land. So, and it's like, okay, you want to take me back with you and call me an angel? I'm cool with that, but there's no, outward manifestation of, it has its own will. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess just to figure, because I had similar, because this is one of those things I was thinking about when I was thinking about, the angel as, a figure in the story, is, an angel is, like you said, has a purpose. An angel is a messenger. And I'm like, what is the angel in Midnight Mass, actually, a messenger of? It seems almost, like you said, to be, this kind of blank entity onto which, in Monsignor Pruitt, for example, kind of writes his desires and his wants and his particular kind of religious interpretations. But
right.
The angel itself is just, it likes to eat people, it lives in a cave. I think it's really interesting actually, because I was reading just a review or an analysis the other day, partly to prep for this, and it talked about how the angel kept Monsignor Pruitt alive and just restored his youth so that it could be transported. And I'm like, that's not in the show. Mm-mm. There's no suggestion that the angel set these actions in motions to be taken to some island in the middle of nowhere off the coast of America. As far as we can tell, this is all Monsignor Pruitt's plan. There's no,
right.
Yeah.
That
doesn't really answer your questions, but I guess I very much agree with your the questions there, your framing of it.
That is true, that there isn't really a lot of agency that this being has.
Thank you for the word. I couldn't think of the word.
He just kind of goes along, except maybe perhaps the one scene where it's almost a little campy. I think he's wearing a white hat and a white big flowy shirt on the beach at night. And for that one moment I was like, oh, is this a monster, enjoying the scenery, or it was the most not human, but I guess autonomous act that this being had done. And then for the rest of the show, really just, not much agency, it seemed.
I interpreted that scene on the beach as being the vampire dressed in the clothing of Monsignor Pruitt, but that it was going out for hunting, trying to find some nourishment. That's how I interpreted it.
Yes.
Yeah, but at the same time, because like Riley goes out to check on him, and he just kind of runs away.
Exactly.
Like it's like.
Yes, like he could have attacked Riley in that moment.
Yeah,
Like
as he does later in the show. But there it's just like, oh no, don't look at me.
Right.
Gotta get out of here.
He was nervous.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that is how it comes across. Like it's like.
Yeah, he definitely doesn't want to be found out. Doesn't want to be
Not
seen.
at that moment. Yeah.
No, not then. The city's completely fine with dressing up in a priest's robes and walking down the center aisle of the church.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem to be bothered. So that was the only thing that I thought was strange about the character of the vampire, whatever the character is of that particular being. It seemed to be this empty, I guess, a signifier. And if we're thinking about, about things, Tommy, what do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. If we, I think the similarity between the Vampire and Midnight Mass and Nosferatu is really important to emphasize. I read that Mike Flanagan's favorite vampire movie is Werner Herzog's Nosferatu from 1979. And if anybody hasn't seen it, it's great. It's a beautiful movie. And so if we consider Nosferatu a subcategory of the Dracula story, it seems, if you watch the original Nosferatu movie, the F.W. Murnau film from 1922, it seems Nosferatu is a bit of a simplification of the Dracula story and the Dracula character. It's certainly more monstrous than the original Stoker Dracula to some extent. It's a little bit simpler. It has less complexity. And then by the time you get to Flanagan and Midnight Mass, the monster design is clearly based on Nosferatu. Flanagan says that Werner Herzog's Nosferatu is his favorite vampire movie, so I mean it's obvious, it's right in your face, and it's even a further sort of stripped down version of the Dracula, right? And I would argue Midnight Mass is definitely a Dracula story, because if you look at the basic plot structure of it, what happens? There's a man who leaves his hometown and goes and gets the Dracula and brings it back to his hometown. I mean, that's the basic plot structure of Dracula. Right? So this is definitely a Dracula story. Yeah. But it's interesting to see that it's a continued evolution of the Nosferatu simplification. So it seems like there is some kind of trajectory there about how the Dracula character keeps getting reduced to this empty signifier, as you say, Stephanie. And it's interesting. I'm trying to think how I feel about that personally as an artist, or if I were an artist, how I would think about that. I think that it's a double-edged sword, to sort of use an overused adage. But I think on the one hand, I do feel less invested in the death of the monster, the fact that it's so stripped down and kind of empty to one extent. When I contemplate as to whether or not it died, there's less emotional attachment. But it works great on the thematic and philosophical level, because the empty signifier allows you to reflect in so many different directions, which is what's great about the literariness of the show.
This was great. I had a really, really good time talking with you all. And you all brought up some really, really interesting points to think about. If the viewers would like more of this type of discussion, please let me know in the comments. And if you like this, please, give it a thumbs up and share it. I'd like to thank my guests for being here with me today and taking the time to prepare things to talk about, and for that we could just kind of bounce our ideas off of each other. And I think we came up with some really interesting points that hopefully the people who are watching this or listening to this will also be able to think about as well. Hopefully they'll share their own ideas as well here in the comment section. I really hope that's kind of what the idea of this was all about, to kind of, foster a discussion. So, yeah, I really enjoyed this. So thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thanks so much.
Well, I really enjoyed seeing you all again and having this opportunity to just have a fun discussion today. It was really, really great. Thanks. So that's all for now. Take care, everybody. And until next time. Bye.